So this video lecture will cover the material of middle childhood, some of the biopsychosocial risks and resiliencies of children in this age group. One of the things we've seen as development has continued from infancy until this point, middle childhood, is this kind of growing social circle around a child. You know, when a child is an infant, their primary caregiver is really the biggest thing in their life, and as they get older, their worlds get bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the things that middle childhood brings is this new social network of school and friends and after school activities and other things that kids in this age range are doing. So their world will get even bigger in adolescence and in young adulthood, but this is a big leap in their world to enter this middle childhood phase and watching how their world is opening up for them. But even still, their family and their caregivers will remain a hugely significant influence on their development. And so a lot has to be assessed with that. And so you look at the closeness of a family system. Do people have extended family living with them or nearby? Or are they growing up in a very nuclear family farther away from extended families? These multi-generational family systems have a huge impact on really kids of any age, but especially in middle childhood as well. So you can see that kids are influenced by their familial context, their cultural context, and their historical contexts. As we get more and more advanced, as we, leave earlier years behind, we see that it's much more common for smaller family groups to be living in separate systems from extended family, when historically that did not used to be the case. So Freud talks about middle childhood being the time of latency. And latency, according to Freud, really, is kind of a slowing or maybe a going underground of all kinds of issues of development. And we see that to some extent in physical development. In earlier developmental periods, we saw an enormous, explosive growth in height and weight and brain development and all of those kinds of things. But in middle childhood, that starts to slow down. Kids, of course, are growing. You can expect to see changes. Obviously, there's a big difference between, say, a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, but things are not happening at quite the pace that they had been happening in other developmental phases. And so when we think about some of the injuries or accidents that happen in middle childhood, they're often kind of related to kids just being out in the world, having accidents, having bike accidents, sports accidents, the kinds of accidents that come with increased activity, and also the kinds of accidents that might come with less and less adult supervision. Kids in middle childhood might be starting to experience more independence than they had in the past. And sometimes adults might overestimate children's safety-related knowledge and their ability to keep themselves safe. They are still kids, even though in many ways they're much more independent than they used to be. And so middle childhood is oftentimes the developmental period of accidental injuries, and that's partly because of the way that their world is opening up. So one thing that is obviously different child to child, but there is a historical trend happening in that puberty appears to be happening earlier and earlier, particularly for girls, than historically it used to. Even 20, 30 years ago, girls, for example, wouldn't really start to get their first period maybe until 13 or 14. But now we're seeing that sometimes at 11, maybe even earlier in some situations. And there does seem to be trends that indicate that African American girls seem to experience puberty even earlier. And there's not necessarily a lot of good data to suggest why that is. It just seems to be a trend that people are noticing. But for all girls, there is a clear linkage between growing obesity rates and earlier onset of puberty. One of the things that is produced in adipose tissue, which is adipose tissue is otherwise known as fat tissue in girls, is estrogen, and estrogen is the kind of the trigger for a lot of changes that we would see in puberty. So as we see girls experiencing more and more obesity, girls and boys, one of the possible consequences of that is earlier puberty. So lots and lots is happening in terms of cognitive development, and Piaget is kind of our cognitive theorist around cognitive development, and the point is pretty significant that one of the major social experiences that happen to most kids in middle childhood is really the beginning of school and the experience of, say, elementary school. And so one of the things that is pointed out is that children will often start school during pre-operational thought, Piaget's second stage, and then they'll finish elementary school when they're in the final stage of cognitive development, formal operations. And in the middle stage, it is known as concrete operations, and all of these changes in terms of Piaget really just reflect how children are more and more able to solve problems using logic, and how children can think through more complex issues and more complex problems, as opposed to the very, very black and white world of the young child or the toddler. And so as they move through these stages and get towards adolescence, they are much more able to use formal operations, and that essentially refers to their ability to solve problems and think in much more abstraction than they previously did. So, in terms of the structure of the brain, which is also developing, the cerebral cortex is that outer layer of brain matter, and it's responsible for all of those high level complicated functions such as memory, language, and reasoning. And that's important because that continues to grow in adolescence. And the other thing that continues to happen is the use it or lose it phenomenon, meaning that as connections between cells in the nervous system are are changing or perhaps not being used, they are gradually eliminated. And kind of the classic example about with this is the use of learning a foreign language. I think it's pretty well known that the younger you are, the easier it is to pick up a second language or an additional language of any kind. And as you get older, it gets harder and harder to do that. That is a reflection of pruning. In other words, the use it or lose it phenomenon, meaning that those brain synapses that are not being used, say, for example, to learn language, are not being utilized, they get eliminated. And that is starting to happen more and more in middle childhood. This slide is just, I think, a really good summary of a lot of the different kinds of development that is happening in middle childhood. And we've talked about the first four of them, and we'll continue to talk about some of the other ones. But one of the things that you can start to see is that ideally, middle childhood is, compared to early childhood and adolescence, kind of a quieter time. Certainly lots of things are happening in terms of development, particularly cognitive development, but it's also a break maybe from the explosive growth of younger years and the explosive growth that is about to happen again in adolescence. So in terms of their emotional development, one of the things that comes with developing brains and growing brains is the ability to mentally organize and articulate emotional experiences. Hopefully at this point, kids in middle childhood have a language to describe emotional experiences and emotional states, and they can start to talk about them and describe them to you. One of the other things that hopefully has happened or is happening in middle childhood is the ability to start to use cognitive strategies to manage emotions. Kids that, say, can kind of talk themselves down, kids that can practice some skill building activities, some coping skills, they can use them hopefully now when perhaps that was harder to do earlier in development. They can see that there sometimes is a need to delay gratification and hopefully control some impulses. All of these things are tasks and hopefully achievements that are happening in middle childhood. To be able to break something down, to accomplish a task incrementally. This is, again, an emotional development, but it's also a cognitive development. And kids are also developing much more of a complicated internal emotional world. And those internalized feelings are shaping their views about themselves, but they're also shaping their behavior. One of the things that is a great reflection about the increasing complexity of the emotional world of someone in middle childhood is the ability to tolerate conflicting feelings. Let's say somebody can be excited for something and scared at the same time. Somebody can be angry at something and also sad at the same time. That is kind of beyond the capacity of most early childhood kids, but they start to have much more ability to do that in middle childhood and hopefully in adolescence. And at this point in middle childhood, kids have, ideally, some increasingly effective defense mechanisms. Middle childhood kids, one of the things that is kind of clear about them is the development maybe of a sense of humor. They can be really funny, and that is actually a very adaptive coping mechanism or defense mechanism that they can now use that perhaps they couldn't use earlier. And so, with the advent of school, with middle childhood really kind of beginning in elementary school and ending in elementary school, there is oftentimes a shift in focus for kids in middle childhood to issues around IQ and school achievement and school ability. And we tend to overemphasize that a lot with kids. Might be the time when kids start to have IQ testing, or maybe they start to have testing around learning disabilities or other kinds of services that might be needed. But one of the things that is really important and also happening in middle childhood is this concept of emotional intelligence, EQ. You know, and it's defined here in these slides, but essentially it's the ability to read a situation, to read a person, to control your impulses, to delay gratification, to be able to regulate your own mood so that you can remain effective in whatever situation that you're in. And so these issues of emotional intelligence have huge social consequences. And social and emotional intelligence are also very key aspects of moral reasoning and moral conduct. Um, you might want to punch a kid in the face who has insulted you, but if you are practicing emotional intelligence, you're controlling that impulse, you're delaying the gratification, say, to smack that other kid, you're walking away, you're keeping yourself relatively calm, and that reflects a great maturity in your emotional development, but also in your social development. Somewhere in there, probably there's a message saying using violence is wrong, for example. Um, for the kid that manages to walk away when he really wants to hit another kid, say, for example. And so that can be part not only of that person's emotional intelligence, but also of their moral reasoning and moral conduct. So Erik Erikson has set out the task of industry versus inferiority in middle childhood. And industry refers to a drive or a wish to acquire new skills and become competent and to be able to do meaningful quote unquote work. And again, sometimes we apply that to school success. And so we start to think about things like grades and whether or not someone's on the honor roll and whether or not someone's a good student and all of those kinds of things. But industry and the resulting feelings of competence are really across the board. Kids want to be competent socially. They want to have a few friends that they like and that they can hang out with. Kids want to be liked by adults, and they want to feel competent in their ability to be liked by teachers or other adults in their life. Kids want to feel competent in their role as siblings or as, in relationship to their caregivers. They want to be seen as good kids, they want to be helpful. And so sometimes with a kid who might be struggling, say, in school and with academic success, you'd want to look for and really build up all of the other areas in their life where they would feel competent. Um, Maybe they're an excellent soccer player. Maybe they're a really excellent big brother or big sister. Maybe they're always the kid that the teacher turns to when the teacher wants to send a note to the office because the teacher knows that they can trust them. All of those issues are also issues of industry and competence. And so I'm pointing that out to sort of bring back the point that it's actually not only about school success. And that leads to a lot of stuff around peer groups. This is the beginning of what will happen more and more in adolescence, which is the shifting of attention to the peer group and maybe away from the family. We think of that as an adolescent or a teenager behavior, and it certainly is, but that behavior is also beginning in middle childhood. The peer group is becoming much more powerful, and being able to follow group norms, whatever those group norms are, depending on the situation that the child is in, and to feel socially competent in the new social world of middle childhood are huge areas of achievement, hopefully, and struggle for some kids as well. Gender identity and gender roles gets raised here in middle childhood, but the reality is that this issue has come up in toddlerhood and in early childhood, that the issue about gender identity isn't suddenly just happening for the first time in middle childhood. It might be because of middle childhood's proximity to puberty, make issues of gender dysphoria, feeling unhappy with one's birth assigned gender, that might bring those feelings up much more strongly because of the experience of puberty. But the idea of identifying gender roles, of identifying how one fits in terms of gender identity and the fluidity of that, is raised here in middle childhood, but that really actually is more accurately described probably as something that has been happening before the middle childhood role. So, again, the importance of school being raised again. This slide brings up something I think very important, which is this third bullet point down, talking about multiple intelligences. And I think this is really important when you think about kids that are coming from a variety of cultural backgrounds or different kinds of community. The idea that if your cultural background or if your social environment or your community is different, say, from your school environment, you would have multiple intelligences. You can figure out how you need to behave and who you need to be, so to speak, in different environments. I think another word that's often used is code switching. You might talk differently with your family than you might, say, talk at school. Or you might do all kinds of things in different social settings that you might not do in school. And so the ability to move in and out of these cultural contexts or these social environments really refers to a type of intelligence that is often overlooked but is really important in the term of multiple intelligences. And whenever we talk about children, really at any point in development, it's always important to recognize the significance of growing up in poverty and the really sort of depressing statistic of the percentage of children living in low-income families, both including poverty and those close to poverty, that you're looking at over the years 40-45% increases in those numbers, and it seems to only be going up. And the idea that poverty is so devastating to children, it just affects every aspect of their life. It affects their family's ability to obtain the resources that they need. It has a very negative effect on the caregiver's emotional health and their parenting practices. If parents are overwhelmed and parents are struggling with just meeting basic needs, there is just less energy available, I think, to the children in their care. And poverty is also crosses the line between family, school, and neighborhood resources. One of the ways that poverty just keeps perpetuating itself is the use of real estate taxes to fund schools. If you live in a wealthier environment, your real estate taxes are relatively high, therefore the schools that you go to will be well resourced. If you live in a more low-income area, your property taxes will be lower, and therefore your schools will be less resourced. And so there's a structural component to that as well as a personal component. And so when you look at some of the special challenges that children face in middle childhood, there's issues around maltreatment, about family violence, about the ways that kids are struggling with those kinds of problems in their life. Middle childhood is interesting because in terms of looking at kids from a DCF perspective, middle childhood kids, although they're still very young, may be seen as less vulnerable than young children and infants, and that might shape whether or not, say, for example, DCF becomes involved with the family or how they treat a family. And that leads that violence that children may be exposed to in childhood, whether it's within their own homes or within their communities, leads to large numbers of kids, particularly in middle childhood, particularly in school settings, that are struggling with PTSD. And PTSD is an extremely serious mental illness in children. And what's, I think, so devastating about it is that it's entirely environmentally generated. It's not as though a child has, say, for example, biologically based schizophrenia. PTSD is entirely preventable if we can change the social environments that create the traumas that kids experience. So it's hard sometimes to put that label on kids, knowing that the true problem is not within themselves, it's within what's going on around them. ADHD is highlighted here, and probably the best piece of information on this slide is the third bullet here, which describes the rates of ADHD between children from 4 to 17 years of age as 11%. So it can be helpful to hold that number in mind, because if you're working in a school where there, say, for example, is quite a lot of community violence, you might have rates of ADHD significantly higher than 11%. So if you see that in your community schools or in your areas where you're doing internships, say, or other kinds of work, what that might lead you to wonder is if children are being misdiagnosed with ADHD when it's something else. And the something else is often PTSD, because there is great overlap in those two disorders and how children look behaviorally. And it's really important to think about the differences you might offer in terms of treatment with a child who has PTSD, for example, versus a child who has ADHD, for example. So the classic medication intervention with children with ADHD is to give them some form of a stimulant, Ritalin. There's many others now on the market that are essentially stimulant-based medications, which work really wonderfully for ADHD kids who truly have that condition. But if you were to give stimulant medication to a child with PTSD, you would not be helping them in any way at all. In fact, you would probably be making their symptoms worse, because if anxiety is at the root of PTSD, being on a stimulant is not going to be a helpful intervention for that kind of illness. So when you think about the kids that you might work with or the school systems that you're in, and you see very high amounts of children carrying that ADHD label, maybe just file that away in your mind, that there's a significant chance that many of them are misdiagnosed. Other conditions that might be becoming much more clear in middle childhood would be one of the autism spectrum disorders, and a lot of times this stuff is coming out in middle childhood because of the influence of school and the fact that the child's social world is opening and new demands are being placed on the child, and they are responding or not responding in ways that people would expect. And along with the school environment also comes access to testing, which is where you might then start to see kids with things like learning disability diagnoses or autism spectrum diagnoses. And so if you have a child that has a significant diagnosis, the likelihood is that they either are on an IEP, an individualized education plan, or perhaps they should be. And sometimes helping children get resources that are available through an individualized education plan can be a really important role for social workers, because that oftentimes makes a huge difference in the success that kids might be able to achieve in school settings. And then following that idea of competency and self-esteem, the more successful you are in that environment, the more successful you then might feel overall. So, more of the special challenges that children are often facing in middle childhood would be some kind of family disruption, and this might be divorce of their family, or uh, the kind of disruption that sometimes comes with living in violence or living in poverty. And you also have the disruption that can be a part of children growing up in military families, frequent moves, the loss of a parent through deployment, the loss of a parent potentially through injury or illness or death. These are all kind of special populations of kids that are looking at additional risk in middle childhood. And so when you look at the risk and protective factors in middle childhood, what you're looking at really are both internal and external risk or protective factors. The internal factors would be, what does that child have within themselves that would be either a risk or a resiliency? And then the external risks or resiliency really refer to what's going on in the family system or in the larger system overall. And so it becomes important to look at both the individual resiliencies or risks, the family resiliencies or risks, and then one step beyond the family, the community or larger system resiliencies and risks. So when you think about implications for social work, there obviously just are many. And a lot of that has to do with not only supporting individual children and what they're trying to go through and what they're developing in, but looking again through the multidimensional perspective and looking at ways that the interaction between child and family, or child and environment, or family and environment is a two-way street and goes in both directions. And so there will be social work interventions that you could do in all areas of a child's life, and remembering that other family members can be critical areas of support and help for children, looking at schools and community attempts to stabilize environments for children. Social workers are often very involved in that, and that has an enormous, potentially positive consequence for kids. And looking at the multi-level risk and protective factors when you're trying to do an assessment of a child or a family, and when you're trying to come up with ideas for interventions. And so a lot of additional practice implications for social work practice also have to do with recognizing the critical influence of the school and also other areas in a child's life. Looking at children's need, particularly in middle childhood, to feel competent. So this might mean things like involving children in treatment plans, really making children involved in all aspects of treatment or connection with a social worker, looking for many ways to build competency in large ways and small ways, um, having appreciation for the newly important peer group and the growth and development that happens in the context of the peer group. And that oftentimes comes back again to that Ericksonian issue about industry versus inferiority, hoping to come out of it with competency. And looking both at the risks and resiliencies within schools that might build a kid up or that might reinforce inequalities, and particularly social workers who will be involved in a school setting are really actually, there's kind of a triad that they're working with. There's the teacher, the family, and the child communications that have to be managed and assisted with. And that can be really huge in helping a child be more successful in the school environment. And so some of these last points I know you can read, so I won't necessarily go on and on about them, but the very last bullet point talks about cultural competency or cultural humility and helping children and adults recognize and respect all forms of diversity and difference, and the kinds of multiple intelligences that are a part of being in a diverse cultural group, whatever that might be, whether that has to do with race or whether it has to do with the diverse cultural experience of, say, being in the military or some other kinds of social environments that kids and families and other adults are constantly code switching in and out of social environments, and that's actually a real strength and something that can be really brought up and praised in someone.